my name is Ruth Beddows, and I'm the Managing Director of GlobalCapital and Euromini Conferences. So thank you very much for coming to this panel. We will not make you late for lunch. I would like my panellists to introduce themselves, starting with Patrick.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. My name is Patrick Seifert. I'm heading the primary markets in Landesbank Baden-Württemberg, which is probably a reference issue in the fund brief space, and I also have the pleasure to serve on the ECBC steering committee since 2019.
Thank you. Boudewijn Dierick, so Deputy Chairman of the ECBC, also Moderator of the European Secured Note Task Force, which I just heard in the previous panel will remain in place for a few years. So that's good to hear. And also working for BNP Paribas on the covered bond side.
I'm Mike McCormick, Head of Covered Bond Origination at Credit Suisse and member of the ECBC Steering Committee.
Steffen Dahmer, I'm Global Head of Covered Bond Marketing at JP Morgan, and in part-time work also looking after the market-related issues at ECBC.
Thomas Cohrs, I run the syndicate for bonds at NordLB.
Filipe Pontual, I'm Managing Director for the ABECIP, which is the Brazilian Mortgage Bankers Association, and part of the Global Issues Working Group at the ECBC.
And so Filipe, as our new market expert, we'd like you to start off by explaining what's happened in Brazil and where the market stands at the moment.
Okay, we're quite happy, as expected last year during the ECBC in Munich plenary meeting. Brazilian banks start issuing by December last year. So 3 large banks did their first issuance last year, as well as a small bank. And right now we have an outstanding of around 1 billion euros in all private placed. We expect to have during this year, by the end of this year, also public placements, because although covered bonds in Brazil are regulated by the central bank, when it comes to public placement, comes under the jurisdiction of the Capital Markets Commission. And so they are working right now on this. We should have a public hearing in July, and the specific rule for covered bonds be public placed by November this year. Otherwise, banks would have to use the public placement rules that are there for IPOs and fixed income, which is quite cumbersome and expensive when it comes to covered bonds. Another tweak that we have to do there is an improvement in the law so that sometime next year we're able to actually tap the international markets, because the way the law was put in place, allowing for tax benefit for foreigners, it was done in a way that only foreigners would open an account in the country that they would benefit from that. So right now we are working with the Ministry of Finance, and they are willing to do so, to promote within Congress the improvement in the law, so that we're going to have direct issuance abroad in, say, in euros or in dollars, and still allow for foreigners to profit from the tax exemption for the Brazilian covered bond.
And are you using the directive as part of that discussion?
The new directive?
With the ministry?
Yes. Well, our law and regulation were done with a lot of support from the ECBC. In the beginning, the government also had the support of the World Bank. And so we already did it, taking it into account what was the beginning of the directive, right? The discussions of the directive. So if anything is not quite there, we eventually going to be able to change. But I think we have a regulation that is pretty much in line with what we've been discussing here in Europe.
Well, that's something that should be a positive for everyone on this stage, hopefully. So going to other markets, Patrick, I know you were involved with the Slovakian deal, which was the first AAA from an EBRD country. What was used there to open up that market?
Well, I think we've had the question on the earlier panel, like what does it need to get started, jurisdiction or assets? I mean, at the end of the day, you you need assets, scalable assets. The jurisdictions basically is kind of the entry barrier, so to speak. And I think PKO has also been very vocal about how much a good regulation helps to boost the market. I think at the end of the day, we're talking about, again, a very, very well-established product, 250 years old. It's not rocket science, it's just that you have to implement it in the proper way. My personal, let's say, recipe would always be like focusing on what works and looking at similarities. We can probably argue endlessly around, differences and, why is a directive not even stronger and trying to harmonize even more. Well, there's always going to be differences. There's going to be differences also in a Baltic, let's say, environment. But what you can clearly see from markets like Poland, from markets like Slovakia, is that they were extremely well received. They're obviously, when you look at Poland, not benefiting from the same type of support that the Euro system is providing to the market. Nevertheless, I think 3 years down the road, they started the journey to 2016. I think I would consider them fully established member of the covered bond family. You can see this in trades that PKO Bank and M Bank have done. 100 investors in the order book, extremely robust funding tool in good and less good market conditions. So all of the features that you typically associate the covered bond with in terms of diversifying, providing duration, cheap funding, I think is something that they got by implementing this in the proper way. And I think that is where I would let's say, take most, let's say, comfort from when talking about, for example, a pan-Baltic, let's say, covered bond market.
And Boudewijn, as you travel constantly around the world promoting covered bonds, what do you see as the next openings and what we'll see next?
Well, there are a few countries outside of Europe that are also working on covered bonds. But what's often the difficult part as well is, okay, one, you need to have assets, you need to have scale. And that's a few criteria, but afterwards is also the ability to set up a structure that works, or legislation. Often legislation is the easiest, because that's comparable to Europe or to other government laws. Even if you would say, well, having a legislation to set it up, as probably Filipe knows and other people know, it takes time. And it's not easy, because you need to explain, okay, what's the position towards depositors, what's the impact on tax authorities, for example, what is the best structure to put in place to keep it simple, to keep it understandable, but also that it works in a single or local country with local laws. Afterwards, what's often also constrained is the country itself, is the country rating, country ceiling. So even if you have very strong assets, strong banks, which maybe have the same rating as the sovereign or very close to the sovereign, it's often difficult then to explain, okay, the rating doesn't get higher, but you get additional security. So for investors, for a Slovak example where you get to AAA, there it makes sense. So investors will buy it and it gets to the LCR. But for non-European countries, and especially now with the potential uncertainty for the future for the third country regime and equivalents, to see what rating do you get to, do you get additional upside for that, and is it worth to set up a whole cover bond to get a better pricing. So that those kind of things come often into play, and that often means that it takes time to set up new programs in other countries.
I would just add to that. I think, as Boudewijn rightly says, we're in a period now where, we're going to think about third country equivalents for countries outside of the EU, although the timeline for that is longer than I think some countries would have liked. And likewise, I think starting from 2022, under the new Basel rules, banks globally can get beneficial risk weighting for covered bonds, which might stimulate more interest abroad for the product. But in addition to trying to find, the right legislative framework and making sure that areas of national discretion are, don't serve to create a little less harmony than we were intending, I think one of the big constraints is always going to be on the hedging side as well. Some of the cases we've talked about in Slovakia or the Baltic region, we have euro assets which we can use, and we see obviously the biggest pocket of investors in the euro market. But as people, in the euro market might start post-QE looking abroad, or people want to gain access to the euro market, it continues to be a challenge for some to actually find the hedging. If you're a AA rated Canadian bank, you can do that yourself. But once you start going down the rating scales, or if you're talking about Brazil, for example, it's going to be challenging to always cost effectively get your assets that are not euro denominated into the euro market. I think the Japanese structure that was done recently had an innovative way of kind of avoiding swaps and the associated costs, but it may not be possible in every jurisdiction. So I think that's something that, as we aspire to a long-term view of a global covered bond market, we probably have to tackle, because the hedging and the structures is very bespoke and challenging for some.
And did you view that structure as a pure covered bond?
Sorry?
Did you view the Japanese structure as a covered bond?
Yes, absolutely.
There was some discussion, that's all.
Oh, no. I think, obviously they had to work within the constraints of their national law. I'm not a Japanese lawyer, so I don't know exactly what those were, but in terms of, dual recourse and, the fundamentals of the structure, I think it works, and I think the investor interest they had for that was a testament to that fact.
And so in the context of what's going to happen next, especially in the wind down of QE, and where we're looking outside of the established markets for new covered or debatable covered bonds to come from, what do we think is going to happen next to the investor bases, and where do we think those developments are going to happen? Steffen?
First of all, I would like to agree what Mike has said, that I think the Japanese had to do, or this project had to deal with the tools which were available. I think they did their best to make it as covered bond traditional as possible, and the techniques are 100% covered bonds. So I'm in his camp, or he's in my camp, whatever. What's next in terms of QE? Well, everybody knows that officially at the end of the year, last year, QE has stopped. However, we all know that redemptions, principles, everything like that are going to be reinvested, and that's happening. What was not probably that clear in the beginning, how the ECB was to do that. They are in the primary market and in the secondary market. Maybe for some that was sort of a surprise, as they thought they're just doing it in the secondaries, but they are active in both. What we have seen in the beginning of the year, obviously, was sort of the typical supply wave, and what supply does with markets is about to widen, but within 3-4 weeks, I think the market totally changed. Because I think it became clear what the ECB is doing and still doing. In addition, the first mumble of a new TLTRO was in the market, and because of that, I think the market turned totally in an investor market back again. We're not as tight as we used to be in the middle or in the third quarter of 18. I think we're still a couple of basis points away. So those guys which did some pre-funding at that point in time, they still did well. But I think when we have seen deals with 6 days with 6 or 7 deals with fantastic order books, you see how the market is under super steam. So, and this is still the case. We have seen a fantastic, I think, first quarter 2019 in terms of supply and in terms of investor appetite. I think that trend, I'm not saying we're moving as fast for another 3/4 of a year, but I definitely see the market not changing at all. Maybe we see some volatility because we are so tight already, but I'm not seeing a change of the pattern. So I think that despite the fact that officially the QE has ended, but it has not, in a way, and we all know that the ECB gonna be 1/3 of the available mass investor. The market remains probably as robust as it is, and as a side effect, obviously, those countries which are not directly affected by the ECB and purchase program, and they still kind of benefiting indirectly or because of that. So I think for here being in Riga and having the knowledge that at the end of the year or maybe beginning of the year we see some issuance from the region, Pan-Baltic, Estonian, we'll have to see, but I think we find, or they find, a very, very good and healthy market condition.
Thomas?
Well, I hear a lot about healthy market conditions, and I seem to be the guy who always says I don't agree on this, but the way the market seems to me right now is completely crazy. I mean, if you look at order books developments, and if you look at issuer behavior in terms of opening their deals with a certain view to where a potential trade should arrive, and then you see what happens in the first half an hour. Order books are routinely now not 20 or 50% oversubscribed, but 200 and 300% oversubscribed. And prices move in not 2 or 3 basis points, which used to be pretty difficult for some time. Now they move in by 5 to 7 and still perform in the aftermarket. And a lot of the investors I see in books right now are not the ones I like to see in there. And some of the ones I like to see in there have come back at the beginning of the year, but are now already starting to withdraw a little bit. So I disagree. I don't think it's a very healthy situation right now, but I can't seem to find the deal that's not performing. So it's a bit like Cassandra out there. This can't go on forever, but apparently, for the time being, it does.
Michael, do you want to respond? You look like you wanted to. Sorry, yeah.
No, I mean, I disagree and agree. One point I disagree is I like any investor in the order book, so if you're listening, please keep that in mind. But on the other hand, I would also agree that we have seen some of the real money accounts in particular, as we've reapproached the spreads that we saw towards the back end of last year, starting to reduce their orders because they're looking for value elsewhere. So I still think we have very strong order books. There's still good relative value for LCR investors, but again, approaching levels where some investors are starting to kind of rethink fair value. And we were on a similar panel, not too long ago, where we kind of took a poll on where people thought, and obviously investors are never going to say they're happy with where the levels are, but you did get the sense that we're kind of reapproaching levels where people are rethinking.
Well, I think it's also worthwhile looking at the market 2019 as compared to 2018, and I think we've experienced a very brutal market phase, I think, in the fourth quarter particularly. So I think seeing a lot of investors coming back at the start of the year was per se extremely recomforting, and I think also testimony, obviously, to all the quality that we attribute typically to the government bond asset class. The fact that the population of investors is changing, again, you can look at it probably various ways. Again, I would rather take comfort because I think it's kind of normal that investors have different views in whether they want to get engaged right now or maybe at a somewhat later stage. So I think the price still helps to reconcile, and we see that the depth of the market is extremely, I would say, good. And many names that have actually not bought a lot while the euro system was kind of distorting the market have come back, so they're still alive and they're still, let's say, comfortable to put money at work. I think at the very end of the day, talking about various views, I think the biggest mistake you could probably do right now is saying, okay, we see some symptoms that we have seen some years ago, in 2016, for example, 10 years Bund kind of trading basically in negative territory. So it will all be as we have experienced afterwards. I don't think just because symptoms are the same that history has to repeat itself. And that's why I think it's kind of normal that maybe investors take various views. For now, market conditions remain receptive, but again, nothing is to be taken for granted, and the homework needs to be done each and every time, and that's why I think we all probably kind of agreed that you need the right value proposition in terms of quality, assets, jurisdiction, and everything tailored to the respective business model that you want to basically place in the market.
No, I agree here, but the thing is, only what was surprising, I think, was that the way back in and then tightening, and especially with the order books growing so fast and the tightening, it went very quickly. And that despite getting also more issuance, so you saw this sort of end of last year a bit more concern, and then suddenly it came back, and some people may say, well, this is going to last again, and it's Valhalla, and things go back to where it used to be. Even though you may sometimes see some signs in the economies that this growth is not as good as before, but then you still saw that the market itself came back very quickly and very positively. So we'll see how long it lasts.
And to be also honest, it's not an isolated covered bond phenomenon. It's Patrick mentioned the bunds where they are, but also the senior preferred market, the senior unsecured market, the traditional one. They're all massively tightening. So I think it's kind of, and probably also to Patrick's point, is kind of when investors don't see an end of this ECB policy for a period of time, and maybe there were in 18 some kind of signs that 1920 will be a game changer. That doesn't look at the moment like it is coming. So if you believe this is the world we have to live in for another couple of years with absolutely no yield or negative yield even, then this maybe is the rotten apple you have to bite in. So, but it is what it is, and the market is as strong. And there's a deal today also in the market, which is I think after half an hour totally oversubscribed. So, yeah, it is what it is.
And do you think that the sort of the widening of the product in terms of the jurisdictions that you can generate covered bonds from will help with that, so that the structure is sound but the yield is better?
Say it again.
Sorry. Do you think the widening of covered bonds into new jurisdictions so that the yield is better, but the structure is as sound, will help with that?
Definitely. I mean, every new jurisdiction which offering some extra basis points is absolutely out of help. So I think that is clearly a helping factor for a jurisdiction like Poland, which offers a phenomenal spread versus traditional or let's say elder jurisdictions, or the Slovakian example already mentioned. They look absolutely attractive for investors, and that's, I think, part of their strong success on top of their perfect homework they did, and their structure, which is absolutely comparable to established markets. But clearly higher beta these days is on vogue.
I was also going to say one important dynamic for the market overall is when you do have new jurisdictions coming online to maybe tap the European market, is also developing their domestic investor base. I think is a healthy outcome, both because it gives international investors comfort that they can refinance locally if they need to, if there's some sort of disruption that maybe has a more negative effect on their name internationally, but also brings more people into the investor base that other issuers can look at as well.
And our colleagues next door are discussing the green aspects or the socially responsible aspects of covereds and wider products. Do you think that those initiatives within the covered bond market are a positive, and where we'll end up in green mortgages and so forth? Mike? Boudewijn?
Oh yeah, I mean, you want to take that one first, Boudewijn?
No, I mean, sometimes the whole green initiative is very positive, and I see it also within the bank or in the market that everybody wants to support it and do more. So yeah, it depends on which product you're going to issue it. Initially, I mean, what you see is often that it's easier to do, for example, a senior and use the proceeds to invest in green than use green assets directly, because often, even though that banks may say, well, I know my assets are, or some of my assets are green, but in order to prove it and to find the info in the systems, especially in your current book, that's very difficult. So for the first, and then probably in a securitization is an easier way to do it, because there you can really select a pool that's green compared to a cover bond where you have a whole program which is backed by one pool. So you can't say that your whole pool is suddenly green, or you need to set up a separate program, which some people have done, which you may see more going forward. Interesting part as well, I think, is that for houses at some point, what's the determining factor to get it green? Because you do renovation, yeah, you do it to probably pay less on your energy bill, to do more insulation or those kind of things. So what's the level you need to do? And maybe insulation in the Nordics, but not necessarily in Southern Europe. So a lot of this it's very interesting, and it will be more standard going forward. So at some point, where does it end in terms of what's green or not green? Because some car manufacturer would say, well, I have my green assets, but it may have a negative impact on my other assets, which are not so green in terms of pricing. So
I think the green product is a very important one, but it doesn't get the credit it should get right now because of the overall environment. I mean, at the moment, as we all agreed, all bonds sell. I mean, a lot of bonds sell that may find it a little bit more difficult than other times. When there would be much more marketing required, more investor work. At the moment, it seems that a lot of bonds sell themselves. I mean, that also, of course, puts our work a little bit into question. Maybe we've been too good in facilitating that. But I think the real proof of the pudding will be when the markets normalize a little bit. We will not have these massive oversubscriptions. And then we hopefully see some performance in the green bonds. that makes them look more interesting, more attractive than the regular bonds, so to speak, of all asset classes, whether they're senior, whether they're agency bonds, or whether they're covers. But at the moment, that is just all washed over with the general market situation.
Wouldn't disagree with that. I think at the other hand of things, I think the development of the green and sustainability trend is so strong that you cannot ignore this anymore. I think a couple of years ago it was the same discussion. You would be talking to issuers, they say, well, I agree in the principle, but it's not the right time to do it. Now it's too much work at the moment, I don't get rewarded for it. I think this is a type of statement you probably get away with less and less. It's still okay not to have a sustainability policy if you think you don't need one, if you issue very little, if, I don't know, pricing plays less of a role, if your peers don't do it, okay, fair enough. But I think a lot of banks that take more of a forward-looking view also say, okay, what can I offer in the future to my clients that set me apart from my competitors? What can I offer my investors that sets me apart from my competitors and peers? How can I make sure that my investor base becomes even more strong and robust if maybe the market support was less of central banks or generally sentiment to change? So I think a lot of those institutions have found it useful to embrace this, let's say, green, sustainable, social bond aspects, and then obviously we get to the point that as a specific institution, is the covered bond the product you use it? Is the senior bond the product you use it? I think as an institution you could probably be using it on various formats. To me that would not necessarily be a breach in logic. From that point of view, my only little regret maybe in terms of directive is that a bit more reference to green sustainable should maybe have been included, just to make sure that this bond is highly, let's say, desired.
And socially responsible housing? Can that go into pools quite easily, I would imagine? Not yet.
I think Thomas made the point about how strict investors are. You talk to let's say the dark green or the really very restrictive sustainable investor. I think they will tell you what they do and what they don't do, and then a broader majority is probably anything that looks sustainable for them is more or less fine. The market is obviously less developed, so from that point of view. Again, it's simply less relevant, but I personally have been on the road last week in terms of a social bond. Investor feedback is clearly positive, and they're looking into these kind of things. And from a European point of view, I think there is a lot of problems that you have to tackle going forward in terms of populism, in terms of unemployment, etc., etc. I'm not saying social bond will solve this problem, but there is a link very clearly between having good policies and, to some extent, being able to fund those policies. So again, could be one tool in itself. When we talk about sustainable, it's probably everyone has green in mind. And I think in terms of a retail product, and I think that gets me back to the initial point in terms of a business model and how sustainable you make that, I think this is where you probably have the biggest leverage, because if you have retail clients that believe in green principles, well, there you have a very, very strong, let's say, kind of leapfrog effect.
And you mentioned the directive, and that it actually mentions the green product. It maybe not to the level that you would like it to, but in terms of the directive, and now it's almost live and nearly there. What would you like each of you to see from its implementation, and what do you hope will come from it in the market? Boudewijn, give Patrick a break.
Well, I think it's already a long process, right? And it will still take time because now it still needs to be implemented in the national law and national legislation, and that might still take a lot of time because in the end, for the directive to be implemented, every country need to make maybe small adjustments, some bigger ones, some smaller ones, and we have to see how much discretion the various countries will use when they have it. I think in the end, a lot of it is already driven by the market in terms of we're discussing extendable maturities, and the fact that it's now you have a clear trigger. It's maybe the insolvency of the issuer, for example. So some programs have this already in place, some don't. In the end, people will do that. People understand that. As it was mentioned in the previous panel, is it really an option already? I don't think so. because people need and want to keep access to a market anyway in terms of funding. So yeah, the whole thing will be implemented, will lead to more harmonization, which is already a trend which is happening for years. I mean, if you look into years ago in terms of no directive, often no legislation in many countries, and now you're talking about very small details which are also being harmonized. And in the past it was more like bigger points which needed to be a bit more compared, and now you see the first thing, for example, when the SMBC came with the Japanese cover bond, okay, they don't have a legislation, but directly they're starting to use the harmonized template, and investors will appreciate that. So you see this already happening in the market, even if it's not yet in the individual laws there. So it's a trend that's continuing.
Yeah, I think continuing on from what Boudewijn was saying, there is still, and I think this was just a necessity of the negotiations that happened and the timeline that they had to get the directive in place, significant discretion at the national level. I think everybody is very aware of that. I know that the CBC has set up a task force to help coordinate that, and the different choices that have to be made across countries. But I guess what I would want to see happen is some agreement on some of the issues like maturity extension, where it has been very controversial, but I think it can be worked through. And given all the dialogue that has happened, and an opportunity that we have now to increase transparency around all these areas of discretion, make sure that investors understand where there may be differences and why those differences exist, and then have a really good blueprint for what other countries can use when they can come back in 4 years' time to try to get the equivalence in the EU, and then we effectively have a global standard built here that can change over time and just help facilitate the market quite a bit. So I think that's always been the ultimate goal. I think we're very, very close to getting there based on all the hard work that's been done, and that's what I would look forward to. Although it's going to still be a lot of work and a lot more panels like this talking about all the differences, etc. But got to do something, right?
Steffen?
I think given that 28 countries, or I think 28 countries were involved and find themselves kind of comfortable with the outcome, is, I think, in a way probably Europe as its best, and I think the next steps is just that every national regulation is implementing that. That will take some time, but I think as everybody is happy with it as an outcome, I think that's good news. For those countries which are not as ready yet as they wish to be, I think it will be the blueprint for going forward, and they will use this directive basically as a guideline, and basically also to negotiate with their domestic regulators about the outcome. And I'm sure that guys like the relevant key stakeholders in Romania would have loved to have this directive in place before, or having such a draft version in front of them when they were negotiating with their domestic finance minister or other departments of relevance. So I think this is certainly the nucleus of further developments in those countries which have not passed the legislation yet in Europe, but also, and we heard that from Filipe in the beginning, that also outside Europe, countries which are about to get ready or almost there will definitely have a look at this directive and will use it and compose with that.
Well, in general, I'm not a friend of any type of regulation, to start out with that. And all the discussions leading to the directive didn't sound that promising to start with, I thought. But I find myself corrected. I think this is probably one of the best pieces of legislation I've seen coming from the European Union in record time as well. And notwithstanding what I said before, I think it has the potential to do what Steffen has just described, to just make this product much more attractive to a lot of jurisdictions, even outside the European Union, but specifically so in the European Union, of course. And to say short, I hope to see many more investors, the ones I like, and I don't like all, as I said, and a lot more issuers to boot. And the biggest thing that this directive can do, I think, to start with, is just remove covered bonds from the little obscure bracket in the capital markets, globally speaking. Not in Germany, not in Denmark, not in Sweden, but globally speaking, it still is an obscure little corner of capital markets. And it now has reached a certain pedestal. The European Commission has put it on that and shines a light on it. And I think that's going to be very valuable. And I hope we all see a lot more to come from that.
And Filipe, what do you hope to use covered bonds for, how to grow them in Brazil? How do you hope covered bonds will grow in Brazil to become part of Thomas's issuance tools?
Well, no, I hope it will grow. Until now, I think things are going as we say envisioned, which is we are working now on a local market. Hopefully, it's going to be a strong local market. We're going to be ready to be able to tap international markets. But of course, then at that point, another problem would have to be addressed, which is the one that Thomas raised, which is cost of swaps, or how do you hedge the currency. So, but that's something that we I think we're going to, at the correct point, we'll find a way to do it. So, and I think this the directive within the European Union helps us sell the product in Brazil, saying, listen, legislators, look into this. It is worth looking because eventually we'll be able to tap a much larger investor base. So let's be part of this, say, international instrument. I think is an important tool to convince local regulators and legislators to help us build the correct environment there.
And of course, we can all have a plenary in Sao Paulo as well. And Patrick, your views on the directive and what will happen next?
Well, I think we've put down something very, important, a milestone. You could say a lot of the things mentioned in there were kind of, practice, best practice type of examples, but this is something that we will have to reference the market against, let's say, over the next couple of years. So it doesn't mean we can't improve. We probably have to improve, and every single issuer will also have an ambition to improve and to be, excelling versus his peers. So I think that's kind of normal. It's not the end, but it's still putting something down, carving it in stone for now, and I think if we would have the same type of achievements in Europe and in other dimensions, I think we would not have the type of problems we have in Europe at the moment. I still wanted to highlight one point that Steffen spoke about before. I think the whole community has been extremely, I would say, aware of the necessity to protect the covered bond because it's so relevant as a product. I think that was accomplished to some extent by not including ESN and similar topics, but I think there is a case very clearly also to look into these type of, let's say, asset-based products, so to speak, to overcome some of the potential, let's say, bottlenecks we have in creating economic growth in Europe, which is what we need at the very end of the day to have a sound market going forward. That would it be, but I think for now a great achievement, and we should not be too shy in recognizing that.
I think it would be the dream to make sure that the economy grows faster.
I guess, yeah.
Well, as promised, we're not going to stand in between you and your lunch, so we're finishing on time. So I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking my panel. Thank you.